Hi everyone, we are back. So like I said in the last video, there are some essential ingredients to really getting ready for birth. Now, as a doula, I arrive when my couples are in early labor, usually still at their home. I help them transition into the hospital, I support them all the way through birth, and then for an hour or two after their babies are born. There's a big spectrum to this, but on average, my time present is about 15 hours for each couple. And since I've supported about 200 couples, I did the math recently and I realized that I've watched women labor for approximately 3,000 hours of my life. Now, I have noticed a thing or two in those 3,000 hours. Many people I work with are surprised or unprepared for the intensity. Maybe they thought it would just be contractions that they would cope with. Maybe they banked heavily on that epidural, not knowing that it doesn't always work fully. Maybe they thought things would be straightforward and intervention wouldn't be brought up. There was a lot of education on the fly, but parents were so often rattled by these birth experiences because they felt unprepared for them. In fact, it's estimated that 1 in 10 women who go through birth emerge feeling some trauma or even PTSD after their birth is over. And I bet you've even had one of those rattled parents try to warn you so that it won't happen to you. They say things like, "No one told me," or "I wish I had," or "you should." So let's talk about the most common rookie mistakes that first time parents make that feed into this problem. So, the 6 common mistakes that first time parents make. The number one is getting to the hospital too early. In fact, this is a really common mistake, and perhaps you've even heard of friends who have done this. They think they're in active labor, but then are sent home when they get to the hospital and they haven't progressed far enough. Why does this happen so frequently? Well, this mistake is a result of not knowing exactly how intense birth gets. If you don't have that understanding of like the scale, the scope of birth, then it's easy to overestimate how far along you are. And the truth is, your provider, your doctor, your midwife is checking those internal markers of progress, through that vaginal exam with their fingers, but you won't know that until you're with them. Meanwhile, you have to judge by outward signs where you are in the process. And these are worth learning because it's demoralizing and frustrating to be sent home because you got there too early. It really sucks the wind out of your labor sails. So let's talk about how you can know when it's really, really real. Like, what are those outward signs? The signs of progress you're watching for, the first one is contractions. I've actually written a 3,000 word article that gets even more involved with this topic, and I'm going to link below so that if you are a nerd and you want to read it, you got it. But here's a quick rundown. Go ahead and download an app for this purpose. Your provider is going to give you a basic guideline for when to call or when to come into the hospital, and they usually give you either the 511 rule or the 311 rule. And these are a measure of the frequency and the length of contractions. The 511 rule is 5 minutes apart. So the contractions are 5 minutes apart, 1 minute long for at least an hour. The 311 rule is 3 minutes apart, 1 minute long for at least an hour. Now, the truth is, many women are still in early labor at the 511 mark, and sometimes even at the 311 mark. It's a good time to notify your staff when you're in labor, but it can still trip you up. Because this basic contraction timing can be misleading, you got to look at like the bigger picture, not just the contraction timing. So another marker of progress is the quality of contractions. In early labor versus active labor, there are distinctive characteristics that you can watch for to help you know, like, am I still in early labor or is it time to go in? In early labor, the contractions have kind of vague, I can't really tell if it's starting or stopping. In active labor, it's obvious. Okay, now I'm in a contraction. Now it's over. In early labor, the contractions are felt low in the front of the belly. In active labor, you're feeling them in the front and in the back. In early labor, they're crampy and subtle. In active labor, there's an obvious build, and it peaks, and then it comes back down like a mountain. In early labor, the contractions are irregular, like 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 11 minutes, 7 minutes. The timing of them is really all over the place. As you're getting into active labor, they start to lock into a regular, predictable pattern. Another sign of progress is bloody show, which we talked about in the last video. Now, I mentioned it as a possible sign that labor is coming, However, it is also a sign of progress through labor. It ekes out over the course of labor, even increasing in how much blood and gook is present. If I'm working with a first-time mom and we can't really tell if she's still in early labor or active labor, one of the first things I look for is, has there been any bloody show? We aren't in a huge hurry if nothing has come out of her body. Although it's not the only sign to watch for, it really helps you know, like, is there much going on with the cervix quite yet? Another big sign of progress that I watch for is behavioral. This is what I'm paying really close attention to. Her focus will shift so that she can't pay attention to anything except getting through that contraction. In early labor, many women are still able to breathe normally and talk normally through contractions, but as they get more intense, she's going to have to pause through the contraction to breathe through it. She can no longer focus on a conversation or whatever task she's been doing between contractions. Now, this focus is contagious, and eventually everyone in the room is going to have to start pausing with her and focusing on helping her to cope. I like to say that birth is a black hole. As she progresses, all of the attention is sucked in like light. It's nature's way of ensuring that the baby isn't born like in the grocery store. So it takes her attention, then it takes all of your attention. Another marker of focus shift is when the mother becomes nonverbal. She can't chat and talk through contractions, but over time, even the pace of her speaking slows down between contractions. It's when the verbal part of the brain is totally quieted down. She will start to communicate with single words, with gestures and noises. If I talk to a client on the phone early in labor and she sounds like, well, I got in the shower for a bit and it was just too hot, so then we went for a walk around the block and I ate some yogurt. No, that's early labor. But if she calls later and I can hear her say, shower, too hot, lying down in a slow, sleepy way, or if the partner is calling me because she can't break concentration to talk, I should be there. We are now in active labor. Another related sign to that, another related sign of progress to watch for is noticeable deep breathing and some sexy noises. As the contractions require more focus, they will begin to require slow, deep breaths. In early labor, she's probably breathing normally, like day-to-day life. Then when she pauses, the breaths get longer and even audible. Long exhales from her mouth that are almost a sigh begin to take over. Then she may voice it a little, kind of like a subtle moan. And as the hormones pick up and really take over, the subtle moan may match the intensity of the contractions. Now, I encourage this because it can really help her cope. It's a self-soothing, relaxing thing to do to get through contractions. But it can also sound like kind of sexual, very personal, even orgasmic. Now, this makes sense when you realize the hormone that causes contractions is the hormone of an orgasm, oxytocin. So here's an anecdote. Once I was at a birth at a nearby hospital. We had just arrived in triage where they determined who was being admitted and who was being sent home. Our nurse had a new nurse shadowing her to learn, the job. When my client went to the restroom, the new nurse asked the experienced one, do all of the doulas teach them that? And the seasoned nurse said, teach them what? The new nurse said, well, they all make that same sound, ooh, ooh. The experienced nurse laughed and said, that's labor. If they have a doula, they actually show up in true labor. So it wasn't, the doula wasn't the correlation, it was that doulas help them know when it's active labor. So it's a sign of positive change, a sign of progress. Now finally, the last sign I'm observing for is when the mother is leaning forward a lot, even getting closer to the ground. Here's why that happens. As the hormone oxytocin influences the body, the blood flow of her body starts to shift. The blood is prioritized around the uterus and the core. The arms and legs get cooler, shaky, and weak. As this begins to happen, many women begin to lean forward on nearby surfaces like tables, beds, and sometimes people. It can look like a gentle leaning forward at first, but it often leads to a hands and knees position over time. It also feels better for many women to let their uterus lean forward as it's contracting. So here's several pictures of women showing the progress of labor through their position, leaning forward and really needing support as their arms and legs are getting shaky and weak. And they're getting more internally focused as well as they get through contractions. So those are the big signs I look for progress: the timing of contractions, the quality of those contractions, any bloody show coming out, the shift in focus for the mother and for everyone else, if she's breathing deep, making some of those moaning noises, and then if she's leaning forward and getting closer to the ground. So the second most common mistake I see first-time parents make is putting all of their eggs into one basket. What I mean by this, it means relying on another person, a method, or one specific tool to be the thing that helps them through. And this can look a few different ways. Sometimes it's one size fits all birth preparation, whether that's a hospital class or an out of hospital class. Now, in a hospital-based birth class, they often assume everyone will buckle in for the ride and use all of the tools. There's an assumption that every woman will get an epidural and it will all be fine. There aren't any coping tools taught most of the time. And some out-of-hospital birth classes teach only non-drug coping and neglect to acknowledge the possible use of pain medication. So both of these are holding on to just one viewpoint and not helping you with the whole gamut of possibilities. The other way this can show up is if you're banking on just one coping style to get you through. And this is similar to the point above, but I want to drive home that most women benefit from having like a full tool chest of techniques and tools to get through birth. Practicing hypnosis is great, but it's best to sprinkle in like some physical coping and maybe more aggressive ideas of coping. Epidurals are amazing. 85% of the time they work perfectly and mothers get great relief. Yet occasionally they only work on one side, aren't fully adequate, or don't arrive in time. Now, whether that's pain meds or hypnosis or visualization, all of these different ways of coping, you can't just hold on to one as the sure thing. Also, it can look like a blind trust that another person will just tell you what to do in labor. Maybe it's your doctor or your midwife or your doula. And the reality is that most providers don't have the time available to sit with you through all of labor. They may check in, they may give ideas, or you may only see them if an intervention is suggested and again towards the end of labor. And even nurses, while assigned to just one or two patients, are pulled in a lot of different directions. They could be present to help, or they could have to split their time. And of course, doulas are fantastic resources and helpers for coping with birth. But because coping with labor is a skill, it's not always something someone does to you. It's best to practice this ahead of time and not just dismiss that your doula is going to help you. So here's how you can know if this is a pitfall you're on the edge of. So perhaps someone tells you their birth experience and you dismiss it because you are banking on that one thing. Another sign that you may be putting all of your eggs into one beautiful basket is if you skip over chapters in the birth book. Bypassing the one on cesareans or bypassing the one on natural birth, if either of these moments prompts the thought that that's not going to happen to me because blank, it's a gift to recognize that moment so you can direct your attention toward, okay, if this happens to me in my birth, how can I get through it? That's the antidote to this simple assumption that many new parents make, this idea of putting all of your hope into one specific path, just planning for what happens on the other end of it. A third common mistake of a first-time parent is preparing for birth with an insidious belief that you can control it, even controlling it in subtle ways. Now, this is another way of saying not planning for the unexpected. And here are a few ways this can show up. First of all, writing a birth plan. Maybe you've heard of this term before. Birth plans are written instructions that new parents make to give to staff during labor. It helps the staff know what the parents are hoping for. They include things like plans for pain medication, desires for intervention, medical procedures on the newborn, and truly there are many motivations for people to write a birth plan. Sometimes it's simply to have it all in one place so that the staff understand more about who you are, what you're hoping for during your birth experience. Sometimes, though, parents misunderstand that writing it down in a birth plan does not guarantee that the birth will follow your plan. For example, if a mother writes into her birth plan that she does not want Pitocin, but her labor is long and drawn out, the birth itself has changed her plan. Relying on a written plan as a decree of how the birth must go can be a sign that new parents aren't considering the truth of the uncontrollable nature of the birth process, thinking that if you write it all down, it won't happen. Now, I am guilty of this one myself in my first labor before I was a doula. My very detailed, well-researched birth plan was quite impressive. I was lucky that my birth was straightforward and nothing had to shake me loose of my plan. However, it was just that. It was luck. Having attended so many births over the years, I now know that most plans are honored if the birth plays out in a simple way. It's when the mother or the baby need extra support that we're now looking at birth plan B. So along with this is not educating yourself about the other side of your plans. For instance, learning to cope with contractions because you're planning an epidural, learning about cesareans when you're putting all pieces in place for a vaginal birth. So this is similar to the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket. However, it becomes an issue of control if you subscribe to the idea of manifestation, as in, I'm only going to think positive thoughts so that I have my planned positive experience. Now, this is a seed that can germinate into trauma if your birth doesn't play out how you imagined it this whole time, because now it becomes your fault that you didn't have enough positive thoughts. There are a lot of ways that birth can play out that are outside of our control and have nothing to do with the people around you. You can influence some of these factors, but there's little you can do to guarantee they don't occur. So a short list of unexpected events that are still within the realm of normal birth. Things like a stall in progress, where perhaps the cervix just hangs out at a certain dilation for hours. Going past your due date and even past 42 weeks. Having a long labor that leaves the mother exhausted and changing her plan. Back labor, which is a specific kind of labor pain caused by the baby's position. And then sometimes the baby goes into distress where its heart rate drops and creates an emergency. All of these events can alter your plan and sideswipe your intention. It's wise to be prepared to do what needs to be done no matter what sort of birth you're given. Now, one way to help yourself meet such challenges is to realize how you are viewing your performance in birth. Sometimes we slip into the idea that the events of our births are pass-fail. Now, whether you give birth with pain medication or without, vaginally or surgically, with a certain intervention or not, is not a sign of success or failure. Birth is not a sporting event. In fact, it's more like a journey. A sporting event, there's winners and losers. With birth, you can't lose. There is just you doing your best, walking the unknown path, and making choices as necessary. This is another way, when we're talking about looking at your birth as pass-fail, it's another way of being outcome-focused, giving moral judgment to the events of your birth. And if you recognize that birth is unpredictable, then you can separate that out from it being a moral judgment about you and what kind of parent you are. Now, instead, the antidote to this one is creating your own marker for success in birth, one that doesn't depend on the birth playing out in a particular way. So rather than what happens in birth, like the length of your labor, the need for intervention, and the need for pain medication, look instead to how you are moving through the twists and turns. What are you bringing to your birth that's true about you, even when there's chaos all around? You can even create a mantra or like a self-reflective question that resonates and helps keep you grounded in this. Some examples. What does this moment need? How am I bringing my love to this moment in my birth? Reminding yourself to stay flexible and resilient. Asking, how am I honoring myself? The fifth common mistake I see is not preparing for the pain of labor with pain now. Now, when people think about mindfulness techniques, they often picture like a man on the mountain, totally peaceful and removed, or even if they practice meditation themselves, they probably have a quiet, uncluttered place to do so with a hardwood floor, a meditation pillow, and a candle. And while it's true that good pain coping has a lot of overlap with mindful awareness practices, it usually looks different when there's true discomfort. Being able to connect to the physical reality of pain coping with the mental requirements is absolutely essential in getting ready for birth. Instead of fitting your image of birth into a neat little meditation image box, expand your ideas of mindfulness to incorporate moving, breathing, making noise, and taking up a lot of space in the room. Now, this is best done by practicing your mental coping techniques in the presence of actual discomfort. And luckily, you can start that today. Notice when you're physically uncomfortable, feeling impatient, or when you're stressed. Like, what are you doing during those times to help yourself get through it? What are you doing to calm yourself down? Are you taking deeper breaths? Are you consciously relaxing your body? Are you giving yourself another positive sensation to feel instead of the pain? Now, these are all the sorts of things women do in labor to cope, and by bringing your awareness to them, you can start to practice and hone it and make choices to cope now. The sixth common mistake of a first-time parent is just losing sight of the big picture. Now, I know it's important to you how your birth goes and how you get through it. It's one of the first big parenting moments in your parenting career, and I know you really want to get it right. It's important to be mindful that this is just one day, or two or three, in the sea of days that will make up who you are as parents. You literally get a new chance to do your best parenting every day for the rest of your life now. There will be so many days to your parenting and so many little fumbles and tiny triumphs. And as I watch new parents walk through their birth journeys, I am so impressed with every step they take is motivated by love. They are doing the best for their babies, yet also taking care of themselves through a big ordeal. And that balance honestly doesn't end when the baby is born. The search for balance between giving your all to your baby while not neglecting yourself is an eternal task. So I once had a client who was a second-time mom, and breastfeeding didn't go well for her the first time. But this time she was more relaxed about it, because after a couple years of parenting her toddler, she had experienced that her love is more, it's bigger, it's much huger than just how she gave birth or how long she breastfed. She loves her child in 1,000 different ways, by cuddling her to sleep, feeding her good food, taking her to the doctor, and disciplining her when necessary. And so she had that long game perspective, and it was easy to keep the big picture in mind because she'd already had a few years of parenting under her belt. But you can make a choice about that now so that you will also keep that perspective. So these 6 common mistakes: getting to the hospital too early, putting all of your eggs in one basket, believing that you can control birth, seeing the events of your birth as pass-fail, not preparing for the pain with pain now, and then losing sight of the big picture. My hope is that you will expand your mind to prepare more completely for this birth thing. You cannot control birth, but you can influence it. So by looking deeply at these different pitfalls you might fall into, you're already, preparing yourself in a more realistic, ideal way. So please leave a question or comment below. I'd love to hear what thoughts this is sparking for you. Of course, if you're finding this useful, share it with your friends so you can talk with them about it too. Keep an eye on your email inbox, because the next video that's coming up is about the proactive steps you can take to help direct this birth thing as much as possible. I will see you in that video.